In the family archive of a man named Rob Simonelli Jr. in New Jersey, there is a photograph his grandfather kept for the rest of his life. It shows a B-17 Flying Fortress on the ground in Italy, and a group of young men standing in front of it. 10 crew members, 1 aircraft, 1 mission still to come. George Simonelli, the man who took that photograph home from the war, was the radio operator on that bomber. He was in his early 20s in the summer of 1944. He would spend the next 60 years of his life explaining to his grandson, without drama, what happened to 7 of the men in that photograph on the morning of July 14th, 1944. And what happened to the other 2 who never came home. This is the story of Mizpah. The aircraft was a B-17G Flying Fortress, serial number 42 to 32109, assigned to the 840th Bomb Squadron of the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of Sterperone, Italy. She had been delivered from the Boeing plant in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in January of 1944, moved through MacDill Field in Florida in February, then Morrison Field in March, before being assigned to the 483rd at Tortorella Field in Italy on March 13th. The group relocated to Sterperone in April, and Mizpah went with them. The name came from Hebrew, from the book of Genesis, chapter 31, verse 49. The verse was a blessing exchanged between men who were about to be separated by distance and time, a plea that a higher power would watch over them when they could no longer watch over each other. The words themselves on the crew's aircraft read simply, "May the Lord look after us while we are absent one from the other." It was the kind of name men chose when they understood, without discussing it directly, that they might need watching over. Mizpah carried 10 men. On the flight deck, First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson occupied the pilot's seat, 24 years old. Born in Escanaba, Michigan, quiet by nature, precise by training, the kind of man who did not waste words or movements. He had flown 17 combat missions over occupied Europe. 17 times he had climbed into a heavy bomber, crossed the Adriatic, entered defended airspace, absorbed flak damage, and returned to Sterperone. 17 times the mathematics had worked in his favor. He knew the mathematics were not permanent. Every man in the 15th Air Force knew them. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a heavy bomber, statistics suggested that 8 would not complete their tour. Some would die over the target, some would die on the way home, some would be captured, some would simply vanish, their aircraft falling into territory that would not be liberated for months or years, their fates recorded in a missing air crew report that a clerk would file in a drawer in Washington. To Swanson's right, Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt occupied the co-pilot seat. From Beloit, Wisconsin, steady, the kind of co-pilot who did not create problems and solved the ones that appeared. Below and forward of the flight deck, in the nose compartment, Second Lieutenant Kenneth W. Dudley manned the bombardier station. From Detroit, Michigan, he sat behind the Norden bomb sight, the most precisely guarded piece of equipment in the American Air War, a device so sensitive to enemy acquisition that bombardiers were instructed to destroy it before capture. Beside Dudley, Second Lieutenant Joseph H. Henderson, Jr. managed the navigation from Dallas, Texas. He carried the maps, the charts, the calculations that told the aircraft where it was and where it needed to go. They were the forward crew. They occupied the nose. Behind the flight deck, Technical Sergeant Frank V. Gramenzi served as flight engineer and top turret gunner. From Camden, New Jersey, the most technically experienced enlisted man aboard, the person who understood the mechanical language of the aircraft better than anyone except possibly Swanson himself. Technical Sergeant George J. Simonelli worked the radio compartment. Staff Sergeants Robert Bell, Charles Kelly, and Paul Hish manned the waist gun and other enlisted positions, the rectangular openings cut into either side of the fuselage, where 50 caliber machine guns tracked enemy fighters. And at the extreme rear of the aircraft, isolated in the smallest compartment on the bomber, Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker sat in the tail gunner position. 10 men, 1 aircraft, 1 mission. The target was Budapest, specifically the Ferencváros railway marshalling yards and the Shell oil refinery in the heart of German-controlled Hungary. By July of 1944, those yards were feeding fuel and supplies eastward to German forces collapsing under the weight of the Soviet summer offensive. Operation Bagration had shattered Army Group Center 3 weeks earlier. The Eastern Front was fracturing. German logistics were under pressure that had not existed at any previous point in the war, and the 15th Air Force had been tasked with increasing that pressure by destroying the infrastructure that connected the Balkans to the front. Budapest was a critical hub. It was also a critical kill zone. The city's air defences in July 1944 were among the heaviest in the Balkans, with multiple heavy flak batteries concentrated around the industrial and railway districts. German 88mm anti-aircraft artillery, the most feared weapon in the European theatre, was capable of reaching 30,000 feet with accuracy that became lethal in sufficient volume. Approximately 60 B-17s from the 483rd lifted off from Sterperone in the pre-dawn hours and climbed toward Hungary in formation. Swanson held Mizpah in position, watching the other aircraft, watching the weather, watching the sky ahead where Budapest waited behind a curtain of black smoke that was not smoke at all, but detonating shells. The formation entered Hungarian airspace at approximately 30,000 feet. The first flak bursts appeared at the outer defensive ring. Black puffs that looked almost decorative from a distance, almost harmless, until the concussion wave arrived a half-second later and the aluminum fuselage flexed under the pressure. Mizpah took early hits, shrapnel in the tail section. Holes punched through the fuselage skin. The aircraft shuddered and held formation. Behind Swanson, the crew stayed at their stations. They were seconds from the target. In the nose compartment, Kenneth Dudley pressed his eye to the Norden bomb site and made the final calculations. Airspeed, wind drift, altitude. The geometry of destruction reduced to numbers. He waited for the precise moment, then released the bomb load. The high explosive dropped away from Mizpah's belly toward the railway yards below. The aircraft lurched upward as the weight fell. Dudley had done his job. The mission objective was complete. In the next half-second, the 88mm shell arrived. It struck the nose directly. The explosion was instantaneous and total. The bombardier station, the navigator position, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass panels, the aluminum framework housing 2 human beings, every instrument mounted to the forward structure. The entire nose peeled up and over the cockpit, missing the tail assembly by inches. Kenneth Dudley and Joseph Henderson died without pain, without warning, without the fraction of a second required to understand what was happening. The center of gravity shifted backward, Mizpah pitched upward and began to stall. Ewald Swanson looked forward. There was no instrument panel. There was no control column. Where the cockpit had ended and the nose had begun, there was now open sky. Cold blue summer sky at 30,000 feet, visible directly from the pilot's seat, because everything between him and that sky had been removed from existence in a single moment. The aircraft was still flying. Somehow, against every expectation of physics, the wings were still generating lift. The 3 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines that had not been struck were still running. The tail surfaces were still attached, and the steel cables that connected those tail surfaces to the cockpit controls, cables that normally ran hidden through the interior of the fuselage, were still intact. Exposed now, hanging in the windblast, but intact. Swanson looked at what remained of his aircraft and understood the situation completely. There was no manual for this. There was no training exercise that covered flying a B-17, with no nose, no instruments, no control column, and bare cables whipping in 300-mile-per-hour wind. There was only the horizon, visible through the massive open cavity ahead, and the throttle levers still connected to 3 functioning engines. He pushed the throttles forward and began. The B-17 was known for one quality above all others: stability. Heavy, broad-winged and forgiving, she was an aircraft that wanted to keep flying even when her crew could barely hold her. Boeing engineers had built inherent aerodynamic stability into the airframe from the earliest prototypes in the mid-1930s. It was the trait that made the Fortress famous, the ability to absorb damage that would have destroyed any other bomber and still bring her crew home. No engineer had planned for what had just happened to Mizpah, but the design philosophy still held. She was refusing to fall. The control cables of a B-17 Flying Fortress, a steel wire rope, approximately 3/8 of an inch in diameter. They run from the cockpit backward through the fuselage in bundled channels, connecting to pulleys and fairleads that redirect them to the rudder, the elevators, and the ailerons. Under normal conditions, they are hidden behind interior panels, invisible and unremarkable. The temperature at 30,000 feet was approximately -44 degrees Celsius, roughly 47 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind through the open nose cavity was moving at close to 300 miles per hour. This was the environment the men were about to work in. According to the histories of the 483rd Bomb Group, reconstructed from Missing Air Crew Report 6901, eyewitness statements from other crews in the formation, and the post-war accounts of the survivors themselves, 3 men kept Mizpah in the air after the nose exploded. The pilot, Swanson, the co-pilot, burnt, and the flight engineer, Frank Gramenzi, who had been manning the top turret gun when the shell hit. Burnt's own control column was gone, torn away with the forward structure, but he stayed in the co-pilot seat, watching the horizon, watching the wings, calling out corrections that Swanson could barely hear over the wind noise. Gramenzi worked between the flight deck and the fuselage behind it, doing what he could with the exposed control system, using the mechanical intuition that had made him the senior enlisted man aboard. Swanson worked the throttles. 3 engines, positioned asymmetrically across the wings, could create yaw by differential power. More thrust on the right pushed the nose left. More thrust on the left pushed it right. It was not flying in any conventional sense. It was negotiating with physics, offering the minimum necessary inputs to keep a structurally compromised aircraft from entering a dive that would end everything. The formation was still ahead, dark shapes against the summer sky, maintaining their heading toward the rally point. Standard procedure was unambiguous. Aircraft that could not maintain formation speed were left behind. Every additional minute over the target meant additional exposure. The other crews could not slow for Mizpah. 2 minutes after the first shell, a second 88mm round struck engine number 2. The inboard right engine took the hit. Oil sprayed across the wing surface. Flames streaked back along the nacelle. The propeller turned 3 more times and seized. Mizpah now had 3 engines instead of 4. The power asymmetry pulled immediately toward the dead engine, and the 3 men on the flight deck compensated as best they could. The formation continued on. 1 mile of separation, then 2. The other crews had not abandoned Mizpah carelessly. They had followed the only procedure that made mathematical sense. But the result was the same. 1 crippled aircraft, no nose, 1 dead engine, 3 men holding her level through the sheer stability of the airframe and the collective refusal to let go. Alone. The problems compounded in silence. Navigation was gone with Henderson. Swanson knew one direction, away from the target, away from the Flak. South and west, and out of Hungarian airspace. Everything else was calculation without instruments, dead reckoning without data, flying by the angle of the summer sun and the position of the horizon through the hole where the cockpit used to end. Fuel was unknown. The gauges had gone with the instrument panel. The right cyclone engines would run smoothly until the fuel exhausted completely, and then they would stop. No warning, no sputtering, silence. Altitude was dropping, not in a dive. In a steady descent of a few hundred feet per minute, the kind of gradual loss that was almost invisible until it became decisive. Behind the flight deck, in the fuselage, the enlisted crew understood their situation. Simonelli in the radio compartment, Bell, Kelly, Hish at the waist positions. Charles Tucker crawling forward from the tail. They could see the exposed cables. They could feel the aircraft's degraded response to every input. They could feel, from the rear of the fuselage, a subtle flexing in the airframe that had not been there before. The kind of movement that suggests stress fractures somewhere in the structure, propagating slowly, invisible from the inside. None of them could reach the pilot. The wind pressure through the open nose cavity made forward movement dangerous. The intercom was damaged. Communication with the flight deck was impossible. They understood what was going to be asked of them without anyone saying it. Swanson understood it too. He could not turn around. He could not signal. He could not communicate directly to the men in the fuselage behind him. But he could hold the throttles steady. He could keep the aircraft at altitude for as long as 3 engines, and inherent airframe stability would allow it. And every additional foot he could hold was a wider margin for the men who needed to jump. At 24,000 feet, a parachute deployed immediately gave a man enough descent time and enough horizontal drift to land some distance from the crash site. That separation mattered. German search parties would converge on the impact point. Distance from that point was the difference between capture in hours and slightly better circumstances on the ground. He stayed on the throttles. The enlisted men jumped one by one from the waist positions, Bell first, then the others. Each departure shifted the aircraft's balance slightly. Each departure made it a little harder for Swanson and Berndt and Gramenzi to hold her level. But the airframe held. The stability that Boeing had designed 30,000 feet ago, in a different decade, in an engineering office in Seattle, continued to save the men who had inherited it. By roughly 10 minutes after the shell hit, the enlisted crew was gone, descending under parachute canopies over the Hungarian countryside south of Budapest. 3 men remained aboard. Gramenzi went next. The flight engineer who had held the aircraft through its worst minutes reached his exit and jumped. Berndt looked at Swanson. No words. The wind would have taken any words before they travelled 6 inches, but the communication was complete. Berndt unbuckled. He stood. He looked back at Swanson one final time, the pilot still locked to the throttles, eyes forward, and then he moved through the crawlway toward the rear of the aircraft and jumped. Ewald Swanson was alone. 1 man, 1 dying aircraft, 30 feet of damaged aluminum and 3 running engines between him and a decision that could not be deferred much longer. The tail was flexing more visibly now. The altitude dropped through 19,000 feet. Without cable tension being managed from within the fuselage, without a co-pilot on the flight deck, Mizpah began wallowing at the edge of stability. Within roughly 2 minutes, altitude fell from 19,000 feet to just above 17. The horizon through the open nose cavity showed Hungarian farmland and the meandering line of the Danube River. Summer landscape, small villages, church spires, the great Hungarian plain, indifferent and waiting. He released the throttles. He unbuckled. The wind pressure through the nose immediately tried to drag him forward. He pushed back against the seat, stood carefully, and moved toward the rear of the flight deck. Behind him, without throttle management, Mizpah began her final turn. A gentle roll to the left that deepened. A nose that dropped below the horizon for the first time since the explosion. The aircraft was committing to a dive that no one was going to stop. Swanson moved fast, through the crawlway, past the bomb bay where the enlisted men had stood minutes before, into the waist gun area, empty now. He grabbed his parachute from the rack, clipped it to his harness. The floor was angled, noticeably angled. The dive was steepening. He reached the window. He looked out at the Hungarian ground. He jumped. The slipstream hit him like a physical impact and spun him sideways. Mizpah flashed past. The engines were still running, the sound already Doppler shifting, as the aircraft accelerated away from him, eye downward, 3 running engines pulling the damaged fuselage toward the ground at increasing speed. He pulled the ripcord. The canopy deployed with a jerk that emptied his lungs. Then relative silence. He watched Mizpah fall. The fuselage fractured at the point where the tail had been flexing, the stress fractures propagating to full structural failure. The rear section peeled away and tumbled. The forward fuselage, stripped of its tail, rotated nose down into a near-vertical plunge. It hit the Hungarian countryside at high speed near Dunavex, a small village on the Danube, some 60 kilometers south of Budapest. The fuel tanks ignited. A column of black smoke rose from the impact site, visible for miles across the flat plain. If Swanson had stayed aboard 30 seconds longer, that smoke column would have been his end. The parachute carried him with the prevailing wind. Below him, scattered farms and forests expanded slowly as the altitude decreased. He tried to steer toward open ground. The canopy provided limited control. The trees below were rising to meet him. He hit the upper branches at approximately 15 miles per hour. Wood snapped. The canopy caught on limbs and arrested his fall partially before he crashed through the lower branches and struck a heavy bough with his left side. His left leg broke on impact, a clean fracture of the tibia between the knee and ankle. Deep lacerations opened along the left thigh, where branches tore through the flight suit and skin. He fell another several feet and stopped, tangled in parachute lines and broken branches. Well above the ground, he could not climb down. He hung in the harness, controlling his breathing, trying to stay conscious against the pain. Below him, he heard German. Wehrmacht infantry arrived within minutes. They had observed the parachutes descending, heard the impact of the aircraft, and moved to collect the American air crew. They found a ladder from a nearby farmhouse. 2 soldiers climbed up and cut the parachute lines. They lowered Swanson carefully, aware of the leg, and laid him on the ground in the forest clearing. A German medic arrived. He examined the fracture, the lacerations, the blood loss. He applied a field splint with wooden boards and cloth strips. He administered morphine from his kit. The pain retreated to a distant register. The treatment was competent. It was what the Geneva Convention framework required, and the Wehrmacht, at this location and in this moment, provided it. The war contained moments of brutality and moments of institutional professionalism, and this was one of the latter. They transported Swanson to a command post, then to a military medical facility, where a German doctor set the fracture under morphine. When he woke, his leg was in plaster from ankle to hip. Over the following days, the rest of Mizpah's crew was captured. All of the men who had jumped came down within a manageable radius of the crash site. The Hungarian countryside in this sector was agricultural lowland, heavily patrolled, well controlled by German and Hungarian occupation forces. There was no cover, no successful evasion, alive, all of them alive, all of them prisoners. And here the crew split, following the procedure the Luftwaffe applied to captured Allied airmen throughout the war. Officers were separated from enlisted men. The 2 groups would spend the next 9 months in different camps. Ewald Swanson and Paul Berndt, the 2 officers who had survived, were transferred north to Stalag Luft 3, near Sagan in the German province of Silesia, about 90 miles southeast of Berlin. Stalag Luft 3 was the Luftwaffe-administered camp specifically designated for captured Allied air officers, and by mid-1944 held more than 3,000 American officers alone. It was the camp that would become famous in post-war cinema as the site of the Great Escape, an event that had taken place 4 months before Swanson's arrived. The enlisted crew, Gramenzi, Simonelli, Bell, Kelly, Hish, Tucker, were sent to Stalag Luft 4 at Gross Tichau in the German province of Pomerania. A separate camp, different guards, different barracks, different routines, different distance to a war that was still, in the summer of 1944, showing no sign of ending soon. For the next 7 months, the crew of Mizpah existed in 2 places at once, officers in Silesia, enlisted men in Pomerania. Both groups thinking, in the way that captured men think, about the same July morning over Budapest. Then the war moved. By late January of 1945, Soviet forces were advancing rapidly through Poland toward the German border. On January 27th, the SS ordered the evacuation of Stalag Luft 3. The prisoners, Swanson and Berndt among them, were marched west into Germany in bitter winter conditions. The evacuation from Sagan is remembered by the men who lived through it as one of the coldest weeks of their lives. They eventually reached transit camps and were consolidated at Stalag 7 near Moosburg in Bavaria by late April. The enlisted crew's journey was longer and harder. On February 6, 1945, the Germans began evacuating Stalag Luft 4. Approximately 6,000 prisoners were marched westward from Pomerania into Germany in what would become known as the Black March or the Shoe Leather Express. 86 days of winter movement through a collapsing country. Inadequate food, inadequate shelter, temperatures that reminded every man of the altitudes they had once flown at without any aircraft to hold on to now. Men died on that march, others escaped in the chaos of the retreat. Gramenzi, Simonelli, and the rest of Mizpah's enlisted crew completed it. On April 29, 1945, elements of the U.S. 14th Armored Division liberated Stalag 7A at Moosburg. Swanson and Berndt were among the roughly 100,000 Allied prisoners freed that day. Approximately 1 day later, on April 30th, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler died in an underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. But the men at Moosburg did not know that yet. What they knew was that American vehicles had reached the camp, and the war for them was ending on a Sunday afternoon in spring. The enlisted men, still moving with their column of Stalag Luft 4 evacuees, were reached by American forces around the same period. 9 months of captivity ended without ceremony. Soldiers gave the freed prisoners food, water, cigarettes. Medical personnel assessed them for injury and disease. They were moved to collection points, then airfields, then processed home. Ewald Swanson returned to the American Midwest. He would eventually settle in Des Plaines, Illinois, where he lived the rest of his life. He married Catherine Stewart. He raised a son. He served as an alderman and city treasurer of Des Plaines. He joined the local Elks Club and the Lions Club and the American Legion Post. He worked a civilian life for decades. He rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. When he did, he described the crew, not himself. He described Dudley and Henderson, the two men who had sat in the most dangerous position on the aircraft without ever having chosen it, who had completed their portion of the mission in the final second before the shell arrived, who had never known whether the bombs they released had reached their target. They had. The railway yards at Budapest were struck that morning. Dudley and Henderson never knew. Kenneth Dudley was buried at the Lorraine American Cemetery in France, Plot D, Row 22, Grave 31. Joseph Henderson was returned home to Texas and buried at Falconbury Cemetery in Groesbeck, not far from Dallas, where he had grown up. Swanson eventually retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He attended 483rd Bomb Group reunions. He remained active in the Bomb Group Association until near the end of his life. He contributed to the book Claims to Fame, the B-17 Flying Fortress, co-written by aviation historian Roger Freeman, a rare instance of Swanson putting his own words on the record about what had happened over Budapest. Frank Gramenzi returned to New Jersey and to his family. His daughter has spoken publicly about her father's service in the years since his death. George Simonelli returned to civilian life, kept his photographs, kept his medals, and passed them all to his grandson before he died. His grandson remembers him telling one specific story about the Pabu camp, that the man in charge of the camp was someone he had gone to high school with. The kind of coincidence that only wartime produces. The others scattered across the country and remembered in whatever way each man chose to remember. Ewald Swanson died on February 28th of 2009 in Des Plaines at the age of 89. He had lived long enough to see aircraft become jets, then become spacecraft, then become things that required no human beings aboard at all. The aircraft he described most clearly in the conversations he did allow himself, in the final years, was Mizpah, the B-17G that lost her nose over Budapest, and flew for 10 minutes on 3 engines and the frozen hands of the 3 men who stayed on the flight deck long enough for everyone else to jump. Kenneth Dudley was 23 years old. Joseph Henderson was in his early 20s. They did not come home. But the aircraft they flew on held together long enough to bring the rest of the crew to the ground alive. And those men spent the rest of their lives carrying the weight of that fact, which is the only way the dead can be honored by the living. Not by forgetting, by remembering exactly what happened and exactly what it cost. And somewhere in a New Jersey home, in a family archive that once belonged to a young radio operator named George Simonelli, there is still a photograph. 10 men, 1 aircraft, 1 mission still ahead of them. That is what the morning of July 14th, 1944 looked like before it began, and that is why we remember what came after.